I'm Carlos Watson. Welcome to Point Taken. Point Taken at the Aspen Ideas Festival. We want to thank Walter and Kitty for letting us be a part of this very special edition. As many of you know who watch us regularly, we just wrapped our first season on Tuesday, but we were having such a good time we decided to do it more and do it, in fact, in Aspen, Colorado at the Ideas Festival. So we all know that college and sex often goes together, sometimes really well, and it's great. Unfortunately, at other times, not quite so well. In fact, we recently all have been horrified by what seems to be an epidemic of assault on college campuses, sexual assault in particular, and the Stanford case involving a former swimmer, Brock Turner, brought it all into sharp relief for many. Now, a number of college presidents have tried to look for ways to fix this, look for ways to move things forward to a different place. One of the ideas has been called affirmative consent, the idea that both participants in a sexual encounter affirmatively, clearly state that this is what I want to do and that it's willing and consensual and clear. And the question for some is, can this idea of affirmative consent be one, if not the main way, to start to stem the epidemic of sexual assaults on campus? Now, we want all of you in our Facebook family to join in. Hit us up on Twitter if you like, hashtag PointTakenPBS. Or if you just want to stick with Facebook, we want you to vote. We want you to go to sift.ly and do what our studio audience here has done, which is vote on the question, do you think affirmative consent is an effective way to start to stem the tide of college sexual assaults? All right, let's get into the conversation with four really good people. I'm going to start with Team Yes. We decided to bring a couple of college presidents out to help us with this. Dr. Diane Harrison is president of CSU, Cal State Northridge, down close to Los Angeles, over 41,000 students, the largest CSU in the system. Sean Decatur, who's a chemist by training, like me, a Cleveland native, who's come back to Ohio not just to root for the Cavaliers, but to lead Kenyon College. And I want to ask you to kick us off, give me your top 3 points in 30 seconds or so on why you think affirmative consent is not only a good idea, but a fundamental positive game changer in this war against sexual assault on college campuses.
Well, thank you, Carlos. And we'd like to start with the first point that for us, affirmative consent isn't about micromanaging individual sexual encounters or sexual relationships, but rather it's about orienting students towards a positive understanding of sexuality, a positive understanding of sexual relationships in a very healthy and respectful way, something that's increasingly important as young people are confused about what it means to be in a healthy sexual relationship. And so that notion of orienting students is important.
We think it also can foster healthier sexual relationships and potentially even more gender equitable relationships by fostering communication and dialogue. And another reason that we want to stress is that we think it reduces ambiguity. There's a lot of ambiguity among students about all of this, their sexual relationships, particularly among freshmen who are younger. And so anything that we can do to help reduce some of that ambiguity, we think is a good thing.
Okay, Team Yes, thank you. We're going to put it on pause for a second, go over here to Team No. We've got Leah Fessler, who may be the closest to this topic, having recently graduated from Middlebury and having written on this topic quite a bit and thought about it a fair amount. And Nancy Gertner, who's been thinking about this a bit too, both originally as a lawyer representing various clients and then later as a federal judge and more recently as a professor at Harvard Law School. So welcome to both of you. Leah, Nancy, give me your top 3 points in 30 seconds. Who's going to give that to me?
I'll start, and then Leah will finish. Clearly, this is, it's great to reorient the cultural conversation, the conversation in the world at large that requires voluntary acts, requires that sex be a voluntary act. But once it is embodied in a legal rule, that's where the problem goes. And so many of these standards talk about voluntary acts conveyed by word, right? But who says yes in the midst of a sexual encounter? How do you enforce that? So other versions of affirmative consent say word and deed. Well, deed is already getting into all the ambiguities of sexual encounters. It doesn't get at the real heart of the matter, as Leah will describe. And it is certainly not a standard that should be implemented on the criminal side, where essentially it reverses the burden of proof, makes it very easy to convict. So it's a good cultural discussion. It's a good political discussion. I have problem with it being implemented. And I do think that if it is implemented, college campuses will be regulating sex.
Now, Leah, you guys used up your 30, but because I like
Yeah, I'm
you,
sorry.
because I like you, because you were working with the judge, I'm going to give you a little more time. What else do you have to say?
Nobody ever kept me in time.
You just took 5 seconds. So I want to say that I think I'm in agreement with what you're saying, though if the question, with what Team Yes is saying, though if the question is, will affirmative consent manage sex on campus, I believe we ought to address, not only orient students to, but aggressively address the myriad cultural impacts that are not only driving gender dynamics and male dominance to the extent that women must assert yes, but also sexual norms, alcohol norms, cultural norms on college at large that are, in my opinion, the aggressive root of a lot of the behavior that's happening.
So Diane, Sean, let me come to you having heard this. If a cynic turned to you and said, affirmative consent sounds like a good idea, but the truth of the matter is, young kids hopped up on alcohol, lots of hormones, 18, 19 years old. That's the last thing that's going to happen, and so this isn't a real solution. This is a Band-Aid. What do you say when you inevitably hear that kind of critique?
I would say that in California, it is state law, so that is what we have to follow. I would say that just like when we try to educate students about drinking and driving, it's taken years for us to change that culture, but we have to do it. I think we're starting. This is a first step, I believe, and I agree the legal ambiguities are there, but what I tell students, yes is not the absence of no. And that's where they get confused. So to me, it's just a first step. It's not a silver bullet.
Sean, what do you say when Leah points out there may be some deeper cultural questions, and at the heart of that, maybe you and I and a lot of other guys we know, that there may be an imbalanced system, and that really there's as much of an issue around men and young men and power dynamics, and that's a conversation that's even more fundamental than the conversation about are we hooking up consensually or not?
And actually, I agree completely that there's some real issues about how gender roles and gender dynamics play out in a wide range of social settings, but certainly on college campuses. I think there's some real challenges we have to address real toxic cultures of masculinity that can exist on campuses, and how do we reorient that culture and begin to take apart that culture, and those are some of the root issues there. At the same time, I agree with Diane that clear rules on consent are far from a magic bullet in any of this. But I also think that clear rules and understanding of consent are an important place to get some of the conversation started, because that is, we have students coming in who are very, I think, both uninformed and unclear about what consent means, and that if we don't actually give some clear terms to be able to have that conversation, then that's an important piece of the overall picture that we'll be missing.
Now, Nancy, you sit in an interesting position because early in your career, you were a lawyer pushing universities to take more action, take more responsibility to make campuses safer for women. But you said you've also seen the flip side of it, which leads you to be worried about affirmative consent and about whether that can deliver true, consistent justice. Say more about your concerns as it relates to affirmative consent.
I think that first, this can be a conversation you can have. You can talk about training, you can talk about showing kids hypotheticals, you can talk about dealing with toxic cultures. When it is then embodied in rules, and administrators have to determine what the lines of affirmative consent were, was it words or deeds, then you wind up with essentially micromanaging sex. Now, interestingly enough, I don't have as much of a problem as others have about that on college campuses, because I think that college campuses should have civility rules. I have enormous problems about it when affirmative consent becomes a rule on the criminal side, because then you're really talking about all the ambiguities of affirmative consent get translated into liberty concerns.
And by ambiguity, you mean we're both 18, it's late at night, it's 2 a.m., we both have been drinking, and did I consent to have sex? Did I consent
Right.
just to kiss a little bit? What did I consent?
Well,
So you're saying that is a real gray area, and you're nervous about mixing criminality with that.
Right. I mean, it was great to move away from no, that where a woman had to say no, to understanding that sex should be a voluntary act. The question is how you enforce it. And the devil is really in the details. So you can't have a contract before we get into bed. I'm sorry, you have to sign this. It is something that's going to be contextual. And the context puts college administrators in the position of regulating kids' sex. And that's where the rules begin to break down.
So Leah, as someone who was a college student not that long ago, what do you think about the idea of affirmative consent actually being used in a real world, on a real basis, or is it just a hopeful, idyllic dream, and that's not really what happened when you were at Middlebury and elsewhere?
I think it falls somewhere in the middle. I think as a woman on campus, my goal, whether idealistic or not, and I believe that as a society we ought to strive that it not be idealistic, is that both as men, women, and all genders, we strive for wanted, consensual, safe, and gratifying, important to talk about the sex actually being good and pleasurable, sex. So I think when we then translate that to the college campus, is it possible that we can do this under the influence of significant alcohol? Is it possible that we can have that under the influence of the myriad social pressures, be it Greek life or any other, subset of Greek life? I don't know. I'm skeptical, but I think it's possible. And so when I think about how we can move towards that reality, I'm a little bit concerned about the idea of literally of the goal of the regulation being we must ask at every step, can I do this, can I do that, can I do that? I think it's assumed that to have safe and gratifying sex, we ought to be entirely in sync about what is permissible and not. Though, and I'm putting myself in a complicated solution because I don't have an explicit alternative solution, and I do think that yes, as opposed to needing to say no, is an absolute step forward, both as a feminist and as a person on a college campus. That being said, it strikes me as fairly unrealistic, and I'm worried about then how when we go into a case where we need to prove what happened, have we really, enabled ourselves to have any more proof than we had before? When I look at confusing sexual cases on campuses right now, what they are trying to prove is was consent said or not. I don't know that saying you must say yes is going to change that reality, especially under the influence of significant intoxication.
Can I respond a little bit?
Please.
I think that, you've raised very important issues, and we cannot talk about sexual relationships on campus, sexual assault, so on, without including those other factors. Yeah. Once you introduce alcohol, then you're right. I mean, judgment goes out in California law. If someone's intoxicated, by law, by definition, they can't give consent. So that complicates all of this. For us, as college presidents, we have to do it all. We have to do alcohol education. We have to do relationship education, anti-discrimination, sexual assault education. So it's hard to pull one piece out and say, this will be the solution. Absolutely. Without all those other things, we don't have a solution.
Sean, do you think, to that point, do you think that the bigger piece of the conversation, maybe more important than affirmative consent, or at least alongside it, is what you guys are or not doing with regard to alcohol? In other words, should we be having as heated a conversation about alcohol and whether it's allowed on campus and whether in many cases fraternities can serve it? Is that where the bulk of this conversation should come if we really want to dramatically decrease the amount of sexual assault on campus, if not eliminate it?
I think alcohol is part of the issue, but I certainly don't want us to put alcohol at the center of the one of the root causes, because and this comes back to Leah's point that there's some deeper root causes here about power dynamics, about the way men and women see each other, that are really the core issues. And so if we could eliminate alcohol on campus, would that eliminate issues around sexual assault, sexual misconduct on campus? I think the answer to that is no. That said, I think that education around alcohol, education about healthy, what it means to have a broader sense of healthy lifestyle in all components. And that means being able to enjoy oneself in a healthy way, to be able to engage in a healthy sexual relationship. That's really an essential piece of it. So it's part of the issue, but I certainly don't want to put that as the centerpiece of any focus.
Let's sort of focus this. On the one hand, talking about cultural change, that's terribly important, and it's actually something on which we all agree. But you also have to enforce disciplinary rules. So people are being kicked out of school for the enforcement of a standard whose boundaries are really quite ambiguous. Now, as I said, the enforcement of that standard in a criminal setting, I'm totally opposed to. So I sat on the ad board at Harvard, and we were getting cases which, you can't at least, not the cases like the Brock-Turner case. I mean, you're talking about all the cases in between, where essentially college administrators are being asked to come up with a sex code. And they're coming up with a sex code in disciplinary proceedings that are confidential. So you're coming up with a really ambiguous sex code because nobody knows what happened in those proceedings. So the issue is not the cultural and important educational issue. The issue is the enforcement of it and the difficulties of enforcement of it and what it does to your campus. I know that California requires it, so that's actually, you have no choice.
Well, I'm going to jump in here just for a moment because at Point Taken, at this point, we usually do something that we love and that presidential candidates fear. We call it fact check. And we take a moment to ask a couple of tough but interesting questions of each side and see how well prepared they are. So you guys ready to participate?
Yes.
All right, here we go. All right, first fact check comes from a study that was just published a couple of weeks ago by researchers at North Carolina State. Now, a survey of male athletes, in fact, there were almost 400 participants at this large public university, NCAA Division I. What percentage said they'd engage in coercive behavior with women? So what percentage of male athletes said they have engaged in coercive behavior with women?
Self-reported.
Self-reported in this particular instance. A is 18%, B is 42%, C is 54%. You guys can actually talk amongst yourselves for 2 seconds. You guys talk amongst yourselves. I'm going to give you about 30 seconds. Who's going to give me the Jeopardy music while we wait for him? Anybody?
Can we ask for a definition of coercive, or is that not part of it?
You cannot ask for that. This judge won't allow it, but you can brainstorm
Can we ask
it out.
for a landline, whatever it's called?
I know, clarification on self-reporting. Who's self-reporting?
We're talking about among these 379 people who were surveyed, how many of these 379 Division I men said that they had been involved in coercive behavior towards women? Was it 18%, 42%, or 54%?
We have an answer.
Yep.
And by the way, Facebook family, you guys can vote too, sift.ly. You go ahead and cast your vote too. We're definitely in favor of franchisement, or the franchise here at Point Taken. All right, here we go. Beep, beep, beep. Leah, Nancy, what's
18.
you guys say 18. Coming out of the box with 18. All right, where are you guys?
We said 18.
18.
18. Great minds think alike and wrong. Okay.
We're
All right,
optimists.
all right. A lot of IQ went the wrong way here. Okay. The answer, in fact, believe it or not, and this was self-reported, 54%.
Wow.
Wow.
Interesting study. Also, by the way, found that male athletes, whether they were intercollegiate or recreational college players, more likely to believe what they called rape myths. For example, if the woman is drunk or doesn't fight back, it's not really rape.
That I believe.
Very interesting. So obviously kind of frames part of the reason why we're having this conversation and the context, as you called it, the underlying culture here. All right, you guys ready for the next question?
Sure.
I hope so.
We can't do worse, so.
So by the way, don't forget, folks, go to sift.ly and vote. We already had some good folks do it on this first one. We see some of the results there. And you can also go to WGBH as well. And the code is WGBH. So we were having fun getting this right. Okay. All right, the second question. Here's the second question. In one poll by the Kaiser Family Foundation, 57% of the public saw college sexual assault as a big problem. So more than half. In a more recent poll by Kaiser and the Washington Post, what percentage of students said the same thing? A, about 50%, B, more than 75%, C, less than 20%. The question again, what percentage of students saw college sexual assault as a big problem in the Kaiser study? Do, 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 do. I guess someone else is supposed to do that. Okay. You guys can go to sift.ly and vote. Also visit us, use the code WGBH, which of course stands for our sponsoring PBS station, WGBH in Boston.
Right.
Okay, a lot more conversation on this one, okay? With confidence, I'm going to go to our college presidents. Sean, Diane, what say you?
We're saying more than 75% because they are victims of the press. It doesn't imply incidents, but rather they're seeing it as a big problem because they're reading about it.
Oh, very interesting. College president indeed. Okay. Nancy and Leah, what say you?
I'm conflicted between 50 and 20.
Gotta land.
Let's just go for the 20.
Go for the 20. Well, in fact, she is right.
Wow.
She is right.
do we know?
Less than 20%.
Do we win anything?
You do. You get to spend more time with me. All right. Well, we have to win something good. Okay. Only 12% of student respondents viewed it as a big problem at their school.
Wow.
At their school.
Not what I would have expected. Interesting there. Okay. This last one's a little bit of an unfair question because I know at least one
Great.
person's going to know the answer to this. But in 1970, this school made the cover of Life magazine. Anyone here remember Life magazine? Few people? Few? Life magazine for being the first in America to institute co-ed dorms. Which school was it? Was it A, Oberlin, B, UCLA, C, Brown? Was it A, Oberlin, B, UCLA, C, Brown? Which college was on the cover of Life magazine as the first to institute co-ed dorms? Berkeley's up there? You know, we're gonna use the broad University of California umbrella. Nice catch, though. Nice catch. We're gonna use the broad. Yeah, there you go. There you go. Go Bears! #1 pick in the NFL draft this year.
Oberlin.
You guys say Oberlin?
Oberlin.
Are you sure?
Yes.
Okay. What say you?
This one I really have to get, Oberlin.
Yeah, this was unfair because Sean spent good time as a dean at Oberlin. In fact, the answer.
Thank you for the softball
I
on
did a little softball there. All right, so we want to continue the conversation a little bit. Before we jump back, though, into our discussion, at Point Taken, we usually have a wonderful poll from our friends at Marist. This time around, we decided to utilize a terrific Gallup poll. A couple interesting things from a 2015 Gallup poll from Inside Higher Ed. Now, not surprisingly, the survey found that 32%, about a third of respondents, agree or strongly agree that sexual assault is prevalent at American colleges and universities. But what surprised me, and may surprise you too, respondents were asked the same question about their own institution. So not just is it an overall problem, but what's going on in my backyard. In that case, only 6% agree or strongly agree that sexual assault is prevalent on their own campuses. So, so interesting in that regard. Diane and Sean, let me turn to you. Whether the answer is 6%, as people said about their own campus, or 32% as they thought about broadly, what do you think, in addition to affirmative consent, are some of the key things that need to happen to dramatically turn the tide on this question over the next decade?
Maybe if I can begin, and I want to sort of circle back to something that Nancy just said a little while ago. You know, there are real challenges on the adjudication of these cases on college campuses, and you know, I think campuses face the dual mandate to make sure that we treat both sides fairly in any process, but then campuses also have the responsibility to be places of support and education for the students at the same time, and those are two very difficult things to balance.
And Sean, I'm sorry, I know what you mean by that. But they may not, because they may not have been in the middle of these cases. Be even more plain. What do you mean that it's hard to separate it, that it's ambiguous? Be even clearer for the audience here about what you actually tend to face at Kenyon, at Oberlin, at other schools.
Well, I think that we wear simultaneously the hat of wanting to, educate our students, and a real mandate to educate our students in terms of both healthy behavior and civil behavior, and what makes a good, not only campus culture, but what's good behavior to go on after graduation. At the same time, as Nancy mentioned, we have the responsibility when something does happen on campus to adjudicate and to go in to find someone either responsible or not responsible in violation of the campus rules. I think that the most of our emphasis, and this is where the notion of affirmative consent has to fit into a larger context, really has to be on that education piece, because really once we get to a point where there's an incident that's happened or a report that's happened and we get to the adjudication point, there really has already been a failure. And it's incredibly difficult and ambiguous to get at that particular incident. What's really most important is for us to have a holistic view of how we address the root causes that we've been talking about, how we make sure that those male students that you were talking about in the survey who respond that if someone is unresponsive, then that's okay, that they understand the definition that no, consent actually has to be clear, knowing, and freely given, that those are all, that education point up front is the piece that I think is absolutely essential.
Leah and Nancy, sound like you guys are about to jump in on this.
I think that we're in agreement, actually. I don't know if this makes for such a good debate.
You know what we say?
okay.
We say point taken. I mean, she took his point. That's good.
Yeah, so I view the responsibility, at least when I agreed to go to a private college, I viewed their responsibility to prevent instances of assault or other sort of damage to occur, to respond adequately, and to resolve it promptly and adequately. And I think that we're on the same page that we wouldn't need to talk about responding and resolving if there wasn't, if our culture was perfect and there wasn't any sort of underlying factors that enabled the situations to surface in the first place. So I think that, and it goes vice versa, that if we want to completely disable ourselves from even needing to respond, we need to have the preventative measures, and I view education as foundational to those preventative measures.
Talk for a minute about hookup culture and the extent to which you think that plays a role in these instances, and maybe even makes it hard or harder in some cases to adjudicate this consistently, fairly, properly.
So when I speak about the influence of hookup culture on rape culture, potential influence, I find it extremely important to clarify that this does not apply to all instances of rape, especially in context of Brock Turner's assault, which is, in my opinion, a crystal clear violation of every sort of social norm. It has nothing to do with the influence of hookup culture on him. It has everything to do with sociopathic behavior that is completely non-permissible, and that's much just my personal opinion. But when it comes to, at large, I spent 4 years on a campus where people were freely having casual sex on a very frequent basis, and I have both personally experienced and interviewed hundreds of women who have experienced the confusion that comes along with blurred lines. When we are engaging sexually in a culture that by nature is supposed to be emotionless and meaningless and non-communicative, it's supposed to be, that sex, and this is not to say that all students engage in this, many students don't, and I don't think it's hard to talk about this without generalizing, but when we are engaging in a type of sex that is supposed to be non-communicative and solely physical and gratifying for the sake of the physical activity and not for the emotional connection, we set ourselves up for these very confusing situations in which afterwards many women are left questioning, was this really just really bad sex? Did he trespass upon my boundaries? Often it's just the day after regret. How does that day after regret then translate for some people? It's a very difficult conversation to have because it's crucially important to not blame victims and not mitigate the damage done by assault. But I think that when students are just freely engaging in these casual sexual norms without thinking critically. It's not to say all don't, but many students not thinking critically about the behavior and the potential emotional impact that that might have on them after the next day, seeing that student in the dining hall. It's just difficult. We set ourselves up to be in very confusing and potentially damaging situations.
Nancy, what did you think when you saw the Brock Turner case?
Well, that's, in one sense, is not remotely complicated. I cannot think of a single circumstance under which there was anything remotely like consent or anything like a voluntary act to, sex with an unconscious woman behind a dumpster. You know what I mean? That's sort of so far out of this discussion that we're having. But the legal rules mattered in the sense that this conversation became a conversation about what the rules should be on campus and what the procedure should be. And there's no question that we and college campuses have had a hard time figuring out what the balance is that you were talking about. I came from a university. Harvard law professors objected to Harvard University's procedures, which were essentially, you come in and complain, and the odds are whatever you said we'll accept. I mean, it was essentially a processless procedure, a due processless procedure. And then when you add to that broad definitions of affirmative consent, you do not have a fair procedure. So we have to separate out, as I think this conversation is doing, the fits and starts and difficulties of dealing with coming up with the appropriate rules and the appropriate procedures and the wider discussion. Turner is not part of that wider discussion because there is nothing about that case that is nuanced or ambiguous in my judgment at all.
Talk to me about the judge. What did you think about what the judge, you're a former judge yourself. Talk to me about the judge.
This was not in the script. But
This is
go
not
on.
in the script?
No,
Yep.
Okay. Well, I think it's interesting. I mean, I sentenced many people over the course of my career. I actually thought that this was an extraordinarily lenient sentence. I was actually very surprised. I do think, though, we have to separate out what he did, the mistake that the judge may have made in this case, which I think is clear, versus the recall petition, which I think is outrageous. And the reason why I think the recall petition is outrageous is that judges are only criticized when they are lenient. They are never criticized when they are off the wall harsh. And if you really want to enforce meaningful judicial temperament, you have to be dealing with both sides of this. So it seems to me we criticize this judge, and we can criticize him mightily, but the question of whether he should be recalled is another question. The whole patchwork quilt of our criminal law has to be examined.
Yes.
Owen Lebree in St. Paul School, this is the kid who was part of the culture at St. Paul and had sex with a young woman. He gets 2 years because that sexual encounter was initiated by a computer. And they had a statute that said, computer sex is a 2-year mandatory minimum. And the structure of the Brock Turner case was so totally different. So that's why this conversation, when you map it onto the criminal law, has to stop and be very cautious about what the rules are and liberty and those issues.
Can I just
Please.
add there, because, with all of our requirements, and I brought this, I don't know if you can see it, this is our 30-page required, it includes federal, state, and campus policies related to victim rights. Very legalistic, but we have to do this. So we're, on the one hand, being forced to adjudicate these kinds of cases and situations. When we do it at our best, when we have a case that is clear-cut, and we refer it to the district attorney, and they say, no, that's not a slam dunk, we're not going to file charges. We have that over and over. So I agree with you that the criminal justice system is broken with regard to sexual assault and other related actions.
Well, it's broken in both respects. So there are the
Yes.
DAs who turn you down if the case is even remotely ambiguous, and many are not. And then there is the history of racism
Yes.
in the criminal justice system, particularly with respect to rape cases. So that's why it's really important to separate out criminal campus procedures and the cultural discussion which we have to have.
Sean, what experience do you have as you think about class and race issues and how those have played into discussions and adjudications of sexual assault, either at Mount Holyoke, where you were for a decade, or at Oberlin, or now at Kenyon?
And without dwelling on any specifics, I think that it's clear that there are a wide range of inequities in our society and on our college campuses, and some of those are on gender, some of those are on sexuality and gender identity, but there are also inequities on issues of race, issues of class. Those actually connect a lot to the social capital and the ability of some students to navigate through the system, either as a claimant or a respondent, and that certainly plays a role in how these cases unfold when they're adjudicated on campus. Class especially plays a role in terms of the resources that students may have to bring to bear and the support systems that students may have to bring to bear. We do have now the case law that governs adjudication of these cases on campuses does say that students can bring in the advisor of their choice, and that advisor can be an attorney. The attorney doesn't function as a counsel for the student in a process, but certainly I think students who are able to have the resources to bring in legal counsel to navigate through a system are at a very different position than students who don't have those resources. And I think those are just added layers here that make all of these ambiguities just even more complex to navigate. And I think that there are also things around the education components that we need to think about here that, if one of the root causes behind sexual assault on campuses are failures of some students to see other students as full human citizens of that campus or of the broader society, and to sort of have a respect and empathy for the rights and position of that person. That's something that is deeply connected to inequities on gender. It's also, I think, at the same time, deeply connected to issues around race and class and other things as well. And that, that core concept of how do we instill a sense of the value of respect and empathy for all people at all times, that in a sense, I think it's the core of our mission as an undergraduate institution, that that we should hope that all of our students graduate with that. At the same time, I think when that fails, we do see very bad things happening, and that includes sexual assault.
You guys, I want to take you to one last topic, which is a number of the researchers who've looked at this matter have said that for young women and for young men on college campus, part of what's been impactful here have been increased access to porn, and changes in our music, which have shaped the way we think about sex and consent, and those sorts of things. Any thoughts on that, Leah, that you want to share? Do you think that is relevant to this epidemic of sexual assault they're hearing, or does that feel like something that is separate and apart?
So there's studies and arguments that go both ways. There are studies that say that porn increases men, especially inexperienced sexual men's susceptibility to attempting to perform potentially aggressive sexual acts. I think that is definitely a reality, though there are also studies that say access to porn results in decreased aggressiveness sexually. So I'm not going to approach it so much on the statistic level, because I think that the argument can be made both ways. However, I do think that for me, the role of pornography in sex on campus is just another relational point to the lack of sufficient sexual education in this country, be it from secondary schools, elementary schools, parents, religious institutions, whatever it may be, that leads students, as they are not in many other countries, for example, in the Netherlands, where they have a very advanced and progressive sexual curriculum, leads inexperienced students who are obviously young people, not even students, who are eager to learn about sex. That's a human drive to turn to pornography. Some pornography is fantastically liberal. Much of mainstream pornography is very male-centric and represents sex that many women, and not all, but many women would perceive to be abusive and transgressive of their boundaries. I think that then translates when those students who are susceptible to that porn and watch it frequently and are not receiving subsequent education about what pleasurable sex looks like, what consent looks like, what sexual communication looks like, it results in them attempting to perform what they view to be normative. I don't know that that's a direct causal effect, though I can personally attest to having been in sexual experiences that felt performatively pornographic, where I had to stop and say, this is ridiculous. It's like it's just terrible, you know? And like many women that I've interviewed report the same thing, and it might seem, you know, like explicit to say that, but I think we need to start having this conversation and start talking about not only is there abusive sex happening, but there's also just a lot of really bad sex happening, and that's not just unfortunate, it represents a lot of difficult systematic and institutional flaws in this country.
Nancy and Diane, I'm going to give you guys a final word here before we go to some more voting in the audience. Nancy, what have we not talked about today that you think we should talk about on this topic?
Well, I think that we've talked at a level of generality. I mean, part of what Leah and I talked about before we got on here was that, so you have a culture, a hookup culture, a culture of casual sex in the context of a world of gender inequality. You know, I mean, when I was a young woman, we knew we were unequal. There was no illusion about it. And there's a funny way in which young women today believe somehow that they've almost gotten the message, everyone has gotten the message, and obviously that is not true. But the best measure of what Leah was just talking about, of course, was the comment of Brock Turner's father. What was it? Numbers of years for 20 minutes of action?
Yes.
This was the embodiment of the kind of pornographic themes that Leah is talking about, and the notion that he felt comfortable saying that out loud in a courtroom to justify a lesser sentence says something about the depth of these attitudes.
Yes.
Diane, what else have we not talked about today that you think we should have brought up in regard to this topic?
There's so much.
Yeah.
One issue I think that complicates all of this even more that we've sort of alluded to, but really we need to take on is the need for the identity transsexualism, so that when individuals, you're talking about gender identity, sexual orientation, you're talking about race, you're talking about all different forms of identity that someone has, and then superimposing sexual behavior on it makes it all that more complicated and begs the question for the responsibility that we have as leaders on campuses of trying to educate all of our students, not just the Greeks, not just the band members or the athletes, but all of our students about healthy sexuality and healthy communication.
Just the heterosexual students.
And that's what I said, yes.
All right, we are going to go to the vote. So you guys voted before, and let's see if we can pull up the numbers and see where you came out. And you good folks in our Facebook family also voted as well. So we ask, can college be managed by a checklist, or what we're calling affirmative consent? And so I'm waiting to see if we're going to get to see what the numbers were back then. So we had, very interesting. All right, so you guys are people voting again, or am I seeing the old numbers? These are new votes. I love this. New votes, fresh votes, we believe. No. Let's go Chicago. Vote early, vote often. All right. Sorry. So cast your votes right now. Can college be managed by a checklist? Now remember, Facebook family, you guys can go to sift.ly, sift.ly. The code is WGBH, which of course stands for our sponsoring PBS station, WGBH. So sift.ly. Please go and vote, code WGBH. Prior to the conversation here, the vote was, we had 24% who voted yes originally,
Go in the opposite direction.
47% no, and 29 not sure. Now, after a spirited conversation, so we're going to still give you a little more time to vote. How do you like that? We're leaving the polls open. We saw what happened with Brexit, and we're worried. So we're leaving more time to vote for all the good people. But at Point Taken, one of the things that we love to do, we believe that debate should and could be healthy, vigorous, pointed, but that it also can be civil. And so we like to see what we learned from the other side. So why don't I start over here and ask the chemist and the social worker what they learned today from the other side. What was the most interesting point you heard from Leah and Nancy? And then I'm going to ask Leah and Nancy what they learned.
I'm going to jump in. I really appreciated your commenting about the need for improvement in the criminal justice system related to these topics, because we are living that every day. And to have a law professor and former judge agree with that makes me feel better.
Well, and I think as well, the, Leah, your point on the importance of positive sexual education, for all students, and actually reaching back further before college is just an integral part of what's needed for young people across the board, I think is a point well taken.
Leah, what, if anything, was the most compelling, most interesting point that you heard from Diane and Sean?
I think I'm not so sure that this is a point so much as just an expression of appreciation as a former student, that you are fully aware of the complexities of the cultural dynamics on your campus, yet you are actively taking steps in the right direction under the awareness that these steps might not perfectly encompass the resolution of this issue, but that they are more positive than what existed before, and that you are actively working in that direction as a former student implicated by the sexual culture. I say thank you to that.
And Nancy, I know you had some strong thoughts here, but what points did they make that you thought were most compelling and most interesting?
I thought that what was really interesting is that this conversation, maybe it's just because I'm a lawyer, invariably slides into discussions about rules and procedures. And your conversation makes it clear that that really is not where this is at all. And that it is not about, rules are bound to be under-inclusive, procedures are bound to be unfair in some situations, and what we really ought to be talking about is the culture. And I thought that was enormously helpful.
Facebook family, we're going to now give you the votes and give all the good folks here the votes. So the first vote, just to refresh you again, before the conversation, 24%, about a quarter of you, said yes, college sex can be managed by a checklist. Almost half of you, 47%, said niet, don't believe it. And about 29% of you were not sure, were on the fence. But here comes the second vote. The yeses stayed roughly the same, 21%, so 24 down to 21. But the noes surged. 65% now are siding up with the judge and the writer, and 15% are not sure. So a very interesting change there across the board. We are going to continue this point-taking conversation with our wonderful audience here. I think we're going to take a few minutes now to ask some of you what you thought, and I wonder if we have a magic microphone right there. In fact, we have two of them because it's twice as nice. It's great. And so I would love to hear from a couple of you about either questions or concerns that you had as you heard this discussion and debate unfold.
I think we had a poll. The poll said that something like 80% of undergraduates didn't think that this sexual assault was a real grave problem on their campuses. So I'm not asking this in a flippant way. So if these are the people who are involved, why do they, and this is such a great problem, why do they think otherwise? I mean, why don't they appreciate the gravity of the situation?
Dan, Sean, you guys want to take a first swing at that? I mean, you're at the heart of it. We're talking about your students.
I think if it hasn't happened to an individual or someone they know, they can blow it off, that it's not a big problem. If it hasn't been in the press in a big way on a campus and really on their radar, they might think it's not a big problem.
Leah, do you have a guess as to why that is?
I mean, to me, this resonates. I completely agree with you. But I think, most controversial. If you poll Americans, do you think that racism is alive and well in this country? I think the vast majority will say no. That's completely false. Racism is still alive and well in this country. That is my personal belief, and I believe it's substantiated by fact and occurrence. That being said, it's all about proximity, However proximate you are to an issue, you're susceptible to believe that your experience is reality. And I think also we're facing a massive phenomenon that perhaps not the vast majority, but a large majority of rapes are not presented to the administration. Many people suffer in silence, as with many other cultural phenomena.
And just as one thing, building on that last point, I think we have a broader cultural challenge, beyond college campuses still, to recognize sexual assault and rape as an issue. That we still exist in the framework or the context of a larger culture that makes the assumption that maybe it's the victim's fault, right? Or that there isn't something that's larger about something that's systematic or problematic that exists. And so, in some ways that doesn't surprise me, in that I think if you polled more broadly, not just restricted to college campuses, but what are the issues around rape, and is rape a serious issue in this country, you might see a similar
Let me make a
response.
lawyer point for a moment. I mean, part of it is also definitional. I can see that people
Exactly.
who are responding to that says, well, no, gee, I never participate in rape. I'm not a rapist. And of course, their definition of what is voluntary sex may be very different. So these polls we need to understand what the respondents are thinking about with that term, how that term is resonating.
What's really interesting to complement that is the percentage of almost 50% of men involved in athletic, when asked, have you like trespassed on people's boundaries or something?
Coercive.
50% said yes, yet I bet when presented with, did you rape somebody?
They'd say no.
Like
Right.
maybe 5 would say yes.
Right. So I mean, it's really a part of the
Yes.
complication is the complication of the definitions here.
Question there?
Is that the college presidents still they're mandated by law to protect women against rape, or everyone against rape. So what is the best way of going about that? Since it is a problem that's nebulous and people are drunk and so on, it seems like the best thing to do is just get a verbal consent.
Nancy, so if we asked you to succeed Drew Faust at Harvard, what would you do?
Well, the problem with, you asked a lot of things in that one question. So one answer to that was, we're asking college campuses to remedy societal problems. And if they're not doing a fabulous job at it all the time, it's because the roots of that problem really go deep. That's one thing. And then the other side of the coin is a rule of affirmative consent that says you have to get a yes is an illusion, in my view. That's not the way sex happens. What'll happen is if it's a man who's being accused, he'll say, well, she said yes, right? I mean, so it's really, we have to enforce the disciplinary rules, but that's not necessarily the best way to do it. It really gets back to the larger discussion here. Disciplinary proceedings are essential, there's no question about it, but the prior question is, what are we teaching kids on campus? How are we teaching it? And then what's the society teaching kids on campus? You really, I do a lot of work in criminal justice issues, that's sort of my specialty, and the criminal justice system becomes the dumping ground for all social welfare, all issues. In one sense, we're asking colleges to go back to where they were when I went to school, which is parents patriae, which is to be substitute parents. Only being substitute parents in 2016 is incredibly complicated. I know this now that my kids are way into their 20s. This is a good thing not to be their parent anymore.
Let me ask a maybe follow-up question to that, and we touched on it earlier, but given that we know alcohol is at least part of the problem, even if we all agree that there are multiple parts of it, and that's one of these, why are college campuses not much more strict about alcohol consumption?
Well, there's different views about how do you educate and prepare students to not binge drink. There are those that think if we teach responsible drinking, that actually leads to less binge drinking. There are those who think, no, take it away, don't have anything around there, don't even talk about it, prohibit it, go back to prohibition practically. I personally believe on a college campus that isn't the best way to do it. And so it's there are a lot of philosophical disagreements in this country about what we do with alcohol, and especially on college campuses. There are many college campuses that serve alcohol to those 21 and over on their campus. Other campuses, it's totally dry, wouldn't even think about it. But what we know is when when students are not able to get to any alcohol, they go off campus and find the alcohol. So depends on where you want to deal with the problem.
But it is a discussion that goes to what are the root causes here? Is it the fraternity system? Is it the culture of sports teams? Is it alcohol? What are the sort of institutional things that make this more likely, which is where we need to be looking?
And I think actually, on alcohol, actually, I don't think it's a root cause, right? Because I think the root cause are these deeper cultural fundamental pieces. At the same time, I know at least on a climate study that we did on our campus, it was about 2/3 of students, both claimants and respondents, who are self-reporting, experiencing, or being involved in a case of sexual misconduct, said alcohol was involved. So I think we don't necessarily need to treat alcohol as a root cause, and as the sense that if we solve the alcohol problem, we solve the larger issue. But at the same time, it's clearly tightly correlated. And
Absolutely.
that if we can get at, if our larger goal is prevention, we actually have to think about what are the things we can do that attack this from the strongly correlated pieces, and I think alcohol is one of them. To come back, I agree strongly with what Diane was saying. I think colleges are in this difficult position of, the law is the law on drinking age. So the drinking
Right.
age is 21. I firmly state that as an institution, we follow the law in terms of the enforcing the drinking age on campus. That said, I think we miss out on a valuable opportunity to teach responsible alcohol consumption because we're not allowed to say or to model or to give a context for what it means to responsibly drink alcohol. And if we think that just because we say that you're not allowed to drink on campus, that means that students are not drinking, we're just kidding ourselves. And the further you try to push it, the more underground it goes and the more dangerous it becomes. And so that's a real challenge for institutions.
Final question here.
As researchers have tried to wrap their minds around the different statistics that inform this conversation, the true rate of rape and sexual assault, the rate of underreporting, the rate of false accusations, all of these things, there have been studies done on campus, there have been studies done off campus. I wonder how much, as you guys try to understand this problem, you think it's possible to extrapolate from one to the other? In other words, is the phenomenon on campus so different from off campus that you can't look to studies done off campus to understand it? And also, can you look at studies done on one campus and compare it to a different institution? So is Duke, Middlebury, and Notre Dame, say, similar enough that it tells us something? So I guess overall, how much can we extrapolate from studies done in one context or place to other places?
I'd love to answer that. I just had this long dialogue with one of our sociology faculty who was in charge of our campus climate survey where we were looking at incidents. He did a meta-analysis of all of the universities that have done prevalence studies. So we hear the 1 in 5 students on US campuses have been raped or sexually assaulted. That statistic is being shot through and through by other studies that keep coming out. The faculty member said to me, here's what I've determined from his meta-analysis. The smaller the response rate on a survey, on a campus, doesn't matter which campus, Kentucky, Stanford, Vanderbilt, Texas, doesn't matter, the larger the incidents they're going to report. For campuses that had 100% response rate, they're going to have a lower incidence. We had a very high response rate and we had a lower incidence, and it's really interesting. So it's all about
Why is that? Why do they
it's
do
about definition. It's about how people define and use the terms. It's also about when you don't have a large response rate, the tendency is for those who have been victims to respond. They're going to respond more so than those who have not been victims. But if you get 100% of your sample, your population, then you're going to get a truer reading of what the incidence is.
But it's another example of where the statistics are less important. I mean,
How you define
even if it's 1 in 25, right? I mean, we should do something about it. So
course.
we focus on the statistics as a way of justifying action or inaction, and it shouldn't be.
We have actually one last bonus question.
Oh,
My name's Dan Porterfield. I'm the president of Franklin and Marshall College. Liberal arts college is very much like Oberlin. And this is a like Kenyon, a fantastic conversation. I would love to see you, Carlos, take this to campuses. You could have hundreds and hundreds of kids and faculty, staff, not only discussing these topics, but just the model for real discussion. It's fantastic.
I actually think that's a terrific idea, and at the risk of getting in trouble with John and Denise and Sheila and the rest of the hardworking crew, I hope we do it. That's a smart idea.
I want to host you.
We'll start in Pennsylvania. I like that. All right.
But I do think there was a little bit of a bias built into the question.
thank you.
Oh, yeah.
Because the question was, can college sex be regulated with by a checklist? Well, obviously the answer to that is no. And Leah, your answer was majestic when you talked about hookup culture. That's exactly why you can't regulate college sex with a checklist. But we have to address a different question. The question is, can we develop a system to fairly adjudicate sexual misconduct? And there, the notion of affirmative consent still seems to me to have merit. Students have to give consent. Not just once, not yesterday, but with each sexual act and reasonably with gradations of sexual activity. That seems like a fair rule. It doesn't seem to me to be, I mean, maybe some cases it's hard to tell, of course. But is the answer to this, we're going to regulate sexual misconduct with no rules? I don't see how that will work. I do think, ultimately, I do think that the presidents won the debate. Because they have to, because we have to run a system that adjudicates sexual misconduct. We're not trying to regulate sex. We're trying to teach students, but also hold them accountable for sexual misconduct.
Diane and Sean, I assume you disagree with him.
Well said.
Yes.
Thank you.
Yes, thank you.
Nancy, what say you to that?
When you added the loosening of the procedures for adjudicating sexual misconduct with affirmative consent, you wind up with a system that could border on the unfair to those who are accused. Because the burden is completely on him to somehow say in this situation that there was affirmative consent. So that the problem is the combination of the procedural rules which vary around the country that were loosened and affirmative consent. Then on the point about whether you're regulating sex, of course you are. You sit on these cases and you're identifying what is appropriate sex and what is misconduct. And so to some degree, you are in fact, even if it's not an a priori, a before checklist, you're doing it afterwards. And the notion that colleges are better at that than judges or lawyers is, an open question. We had some very naughty cases when I was on the administrative board at Harvard, and when you are regulating sex, and you're regulating sex oftentimes by people of one generation regulating sex of kids from another, it has to be done because there has to be some disciplinary structure. But I really think that it has to be that we have to look at the procedures, and I'm open to affirmative consent in that setting, as I said before. But that can't be where the action is. The action is where you all were talking.
Leah, we're going to give you the final word of the entire set.
Oh my God.
Can we allow him to finish what he was going to say?
Oh, did he have more? Yeah.
Ultimately, your issue then is with the federal government.
Yes.
Because the colleges are complying with.
Not affirmative consent. The federal government is not requiring affirmative consent. California is. The colleges.
But yes, but you said your problem was with the procedures.
Right.
But you also just said you didn't have as much of a problem with affirmative consent as long as the procedures were not so loose that affirmative consent would somehow be used to take away the fairness for the accused.
For the most part, the Title IX, the Office of Civil Rights, required preponderance of the evidence, which is the lesser standard. But all the other questions about representation of counsel, whether there is an independent adjudicator or whether it's someone from the Title IX office, different universities have done different things. The de minimis was preponderance of the evidence. So there really is a range of procedures, some of which are quite fair, some of which are not.
So, I mean, I think that I'm in agreement with you that the question of will affirmative consent manage sex on campus, I think we're all in agreement that that is not a solution. It's a step. It's not a solution. It would definitely not entirely manage it, though I think that when we talk about Title IX, we talk about the fact that Title IX basically it guarantees women an equal right to educational opportunities on campus, that to then say that I am not in favor of consent enables us to then, like, by the correlative property, say that I am in favor, I am okay with people having sex that is non-consensual, which is potentially in direct violation of a woman's opportunity to educational safety and freedom. So I think that we're all in agreement that, at least I'm in agreement with you that consent is necessary and affirmative consent is a step forward, though I think we are all also in some sort of an agreement that we're kind of stuck between a rock and a hard place on how we go about administering that procedurally. I'm certainly not the one that would write those procedures.
We're going to leave it here until next year. Thank you, everybody, and thank you for 4 wonderful, wonderful panels. Big hand, please, for our panelists today.